At dawn on June 6, 1944, the sea burned with light. The horizon was a jagged scar of fire and steel, and from that inferno came the smallest of boats, fragile silhouettes crawling toward a fortress carved into the cliffs of Normandy. Inside those boats, 225 U.S. Army Rangers crouched beneath the spray, clutching ropes, rifles, and the unshakable knowledge that they had been chosen for something almost suicidal. Their target was a set of cliffs so steep they might as well have been walls of iron, the Pointe du Hoc. Above those cliffs, the Germans waited. Concrete bunkers stared out over the English Channel like blunt blind eyes, each armed with 155mm guns that could annihilate the Allied invasion fleet. The defenders had the high ground, the fortifications, and every advantage that centuries of military logic said should make an assault impossible. And yet, as the wind tore through the waves and the sky filled with smoke, the Rangers pressed forward. The Germans watched through binoculars as the boats neared the shore. They saw the black specks of men climbing out, dragging ladders and ropes through the surf. They must have wondered what kind of madness drove these Americans to climb straight into the mouth of death. This was not a grand invasion. It was not the clash of armies. It was a knife fight against gravity, stone, and machine guns. Pointe du Hoc was a battle measured not in miles, but in inches, each one bought with blood. If you're drawn to the hidden corners of World War II, to the moments of impossible courage buried beneath the noise of history, then stay with this story. Like and share if you believe these forgotten battles deserve to be remembered, because what happened on those cliffs didn't just change D-Day, it redefined what men could endure when the world's future hung by a rope. The night before the invasion, the English Channel was restless. The wind clawed at the dark water, and the sea answered in kind, heaving against the hulls of the small canvas-sided landing craft that rocked endlessly in the swells. Inside one of them, Captain James Rudder of the 2nd Ranger Battalion gripped the metal edge of his boat and stared through the mist. The men beside him sat silent, faces hidden beneath helmets, hands trembling not from fear but from cold. They had rehearsed the climb 100 times on the chalk cliffs of southern England, but they all knew that practice cliffs didn't shoot back. Hours earlier, Rudder's men had been briefed one last time. Their orders were simple in words, impossible in action. Scale the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, seize the German battery of 150mm guns, threatening Omaha and Utah beaches, and hold until relieved. The plan was to land precisely at 0630 under cover of the naval bombardment, and use rocket-fired grappling hooks and ladders borrowed from London fire brigades to climb the sheer 100-foot cliff face. If they failed, the entire western invasion flank could be raked with German fire before the first soldiers ever reached the beaches. When dawn began to bleed across the horizon, the sky flickered with flashes from the Allied fleet. The bombardment had begun. The air hummed with the deep, throaty rhythm of battleships spitting fire toward the coast. Columns of smoke rose from the shoreline like black fingers. The Rangers clutched their weapons tighter, the spray of seawater mixing with the acrid tang of cordite that drifted through the wind. 5 minutes, came the shout from the coxswain. The words were barely audible above the roar of engines and artillery. Men tightened their straps, checked their rifles again, and reached instinctively for the ropes piled at their feet. Each of those ropes, coiled, soaked, heavy, was their only ladder to the top of the world. The closer they came, the rougher the sea grew. The small craft pitched violently, slamming against invisible waves. Men vomited over the sides, wiping their mouths with trembling hands, too proud or too stubborn to show weakness. To their right, they could see other landing craft struggling against the current, some drifting off course. The wind was stronger than forecast. It pushed them east, throwing the meticulously planned assault into disarray before a single man even landed. The cliffs appeared suddenly through the haze, dark, jagged, and immense. They looked like the walls of some ancient fortress, the kind that legend said couldn't be taken by force. Every few seconds, German shells exploded along the shoreline, geysers of sand and seawater erupting skyward. Machine guns chattered from bunkers hidden in the rock, tracing the water with lines of white foam. "Hold on!" someone shouted, and the boat lurched as a shell exploded nearby. Fragments of shrapnel peppered the hull. One man screamed. Another crossed himself. Rudder clenched his jaw and looked up, his eyes fixed on the cliffs that loomed like a promise and a warning. When the first boat grounded on the narrow strip of sand, chaos swallowed everything. The ramp dropped, and immediately machine gun fire ripped through the air. Men fell before they could even step forward, their bodies collapsing into the surf. The rest leapt out, wading through waist-high water, dragging ropes, ladders, and flamethrowers through the sand as bullets hissed around them. "Go! Go!" Rudder shouted, his voice raw, almost drowned by the storm of noise. The ropes were fired first. Small rockets hissed upward, trailing wires that arced against the sky before catching the cliff's edge. Grappling hooks bit into the rock, and the men began to climb. The ladders went up next, ungainly wooden things hauled from the boats and propped against the wall of stone. The climb was madness. The cliff face was slick with rain and mud, the ropes heavy and wet. The Germans, realizing what was happening, threw grenades down the slopes and fired pistols at the figures clawing upward. One grenade landed near the base of a rope, exploding in a flash of fire and smoke. The rope snapped, and the man on it tumbled backward into the waves. Another caught fire from a tracer round, the flames licking upward toward the climbers. Still, they climbed. Private Jack Lamel, a radio operator from New Jersey, dug his boots into the mud and heaved himself upward, one hand at a time. The world narrowed to the sound of his own breath and the pounding of his heart. Every foot gained was a small eternity. Every slip threatened the end. When he finally reached the top, he rolled over the edge and landed in a crater. The first thing he saw was smoke. The second was a German soldier running toward him with a grenade. Lamel fired once, twice, and the man fell. Below him, more Rangers were making the climb. Some reached the summit only to be cut down instantly. Others vanished into the haze, their bodies claimed by the sea. But they kept coming. Rope after rope, man after man. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing, men scaling sheer cliffs under machine gun fire, refusing to die when every law of war said they should. By mid-morning, a small group of survivors had carved out a foothold at the top. They were cut off from the beach, their radios waterlogged, their numbers already halved. Yet against the smoke and chaos, a strange kind of stillness settled over them, a grim determination that no one could quite explain. They had come too far to stop now. Captain Rudder crawled to the top shortly after, dragging himself over the edge with bleeding hands. He stood for a moment, chest heaving, then looked down the sheer wall they had climbed. Below, the waves crashed endlessly against the rocks. And for the first time, he realized how close they had come to never leaving the water at all. He turned toward the inland side of the cliff and raised his rifle. "Forward," he said. The Rangers moved into the unknown. The moment they crested the cliff, the illusion of safety vanished. The air was alive with bullets, tracers snapping past like streaks of lightning. The top of Pointe du Hoc was no flat plateau. It was a maze of craters, trenches, and shattered bunkers, torn apart by the naval bombardment that had softened the position hours earlier. Smoke curled from burning grass and shattered concrete. The smell of cordite mixed with damp earth and something else, something metallic and sour, blood. Captain James Rudder motioned his men forward. There were only fragments of the original companies left. Some squads reduced to 5 or 6 men, others to none at all. Radios were useless, soaked through with seawater. They couldn't call for help, and the nearest Allied units were still pinned miles away on the beaches below. The Rangers were alone on the cliffs, surrounded by German defenses that had survived the shelling. "Stay low, move fast," Rudder barked, crawling over the lip of a crater. The order felt unnecessary. No one could stand in that kind of fire. Every few seconds, the cliff shuddered under the impact of artillery from deeper inland. The Germans were disoriented but not broken. They knew the high ground still mattered. They knew those cliffs controlled the beaches below. Private Lamel and Sergeant Petty moved ahead, weaving through bomb craters that had turned the ground into a twisted moonscape. Every mound of dirt might hide a machine gun nest. Every shadow could be death. Lamel spotted movement near a concrete casemate and signaled. They sprinted forward, dropping beside the bunker's firing slit. He could hear the muffled voices of Germans inside, the clatter of belts being reloaded. Lamel pulled a grenade from his jacket, pulled the pin with his teeth, and lobbed it through the narrow opening. The explosion shook the bunker, followed by silence and the acrid hiss of dust. They entered, rifles raised. 2 German gunners lay sprawled across the weapon, their bodies still smoking. Outside, a ranger screamed for a medic. Another collapsed beside him, hit in the shoulder by a sniper's round. The medic, a kid barely 20, crawled through the dirt, pressing his hands against the wound as shells burst in the distance. No one spoke. They just moved, instinct carrying them forward when thought would have meant paralysis. When Rudder regrouped his men near the central path that cut through the gun emplacements, he saw it immediately, something wrong. The great artillery pieces, the 150mm guns that had justified this suicide mission, weren't there. The concrete bunkers were empty. Only logs and camouflage netting filled the gun pits. The guns had been moved, hidden somewhere inland, where they could still reach the beaches. The Rangers had climbed through hell to find ghosts. The news spread quickly, a ripple of disbelief. They had expected the fight to end here. Instead, it was just beginning. "They moved them!" One man shouted, fury and exhaustion twisting his voice. Rudder didn't answer. He knew what came next. They couldn't stop. They had to find those guns. German reinforcements began probing the cliffs, creeping forward through the smoke. The Rangers scattered into small teams, using the craters as cover. The firefight became brutal and intimate. Close-quarters combat, fought with pistols, knives, and grenades. Every bunker had to be cleared by hand. They fired through doorways, kicked through concrete dust, and silenced gun crews one by one. The Germans fought back hard, unwilling to surrender the high ground that gave them such terrible power over the beaches below. Lamel and Petty pushed inland along a narrow trench, stepping over spent shell casings and bodies. They moved silently, listening for the rhythmic pulse of artillery fire somewhere to the south. Every time they thought they were close, the sound shifted, echoing through the ruins. Then as they rounded a hedgerow, they found them. 5 German 150mm guns, perfectly intact, camouflaged under trees along a dirt road. Each gun was aimed toward Omaha Beach, ready to fire on the thousands of men still fighting for their lives below. Lamel froze. There were no guards nearby, just a few mechanics and supply runners moving in the distance. He looked at Petty. They both knew what had to be done. They moved quickly, laying thermite grenades into the breeches of each gun. The white-hot metal hissed as it ate through the steel, seizing the mechanisms beyond repair. One by one, the weapons melted from within, their barrels sagging like wax candles. The mission that had begun in chaos had suddenly found its purpose. As they pulled back, Lamel turned to watch the smoke rise through the trees. It wasn't triumph he felt, but disbelief. After everything, the sea, the cliffs, the dead, they had actually done it. Back at the cliff, the fight was still raging. German snipers fired from the ruins of an observation post. Mortars fell blindly, each explosion throwing dirt and bone into the air. The Rangers held what little ground they could, dragging the wounded into the cover of bomb craters. They had no communication with the fleet, no resupply, and no guarantee that anyone even knew they were alive. But they held. By evening, the Germans launched their first counterattack. Infantry stormed the plateau from the south, shouting orders in the fog. The Rangers met them with everything they had, rifles, grenades, even captured machine guns pried from destroyed bunkers. The fighting was savage and close. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing with bayonets, punching, clawing, screaming. When it was over, the ground was carpeted with bodies. As night fell, the cliffs grew eerily quiet. The wind moaned through the wire, carrying with it the faint sound of the sea. The surviving Rangers huddled together in the dark, reloading what few rounds remained. Rudder sat among them, writing a brief note in his logbook by the flicker of a dying flashlight. "We hold Pointe du Hoc. Situation desperate. Supplies gone. Casualties high. We will not withdraw." Far below, the distant flashes of the naval guns continued to light the horizon. But up on the cliffs, surrounded and half-starved, the Rangers dug in, waiting for dawn and whatever hell it would bring next. By dawn, the world above Pointe du Hoc looked like something torn from the edge of creation. The mist had thickened into a grey shroud, broken only by the dull flashes of sporadic gunfire. The ground was cratered beyond recognition. Grass burned away, bunkers cracked open like skulls. Everywhere lay the remnants of what had once been men. Helmets half buried in mud, rifles twisted from heat, boots jutting from the earth like gravestones. The Rangers who still stood were ghosts moving through the ruins, filthy, sleepless and hollow-eyed. Captain Rudder's voice was rough, more from smoke than exhaustion. He had sent runners in every direction the night before, searching for any sign of reinforcements. None had returned. Their radios were dead, soaked beyond repair, and the cliffs cut them off from all help. They could only guess what was happening on the beaches below. Was the invasion succeeding? Had Omaha fallen? For all they knew, they were the last Americans alive in Normandy. The Germans were coming again. You could hear them before you saw them, the rattle of chains, the shouts in the fog, the heavy tread of boots on earth. The Rangers crouched low, checking their weapons, counting bullets with grim precision. Most had less than 20 rounds left. Some carried only pistols scavenged from the dead. Yet none of them thought about surrender. They had not crossed that ocean to give up now. The first attack came from the east, through the smoke and silence. A line of grey uniforms emerged, rifles glinting, grenades at the ready. The Rangers opened fire, short controlled bursts from rifles, and captured MG-42s. The sound tore through the mist, sharp and mechanical. Germans fell, but more took their place, spreading out, probing the flanks. One squad slipped close enough to lob grenades into the craters. The explosions lit the haze like lightning. Dirt and bodies rained down together. Sergeant Petty was hit in the leg, thrown backward into the mud. Lommel dragged him behind a shattered concrete wall, pressing a bandage over the wound. "You'll live," Lommel said, though his voice lacked conviction. Petty just nodded and handed him his rifle. "You'll need it more than I will." By mid-morning, the fog began to lift. It revealed a nightmare landscape of trenches, wire and smoke stretching toward the inland fields. The Rangers had turned the ruins into a fortress of their own. Machine guns propped on crater lips, grenades lined up like prayer stones. The smell of death was everywhere, thick enough to taste. And then came something new, the low growl of engines. Tanks. German Panzer IV, advancing cautiously from the south. The Rangers stared in disbelief. They had no anti-tank guns left. Only a handful of bazookas with soggy rockets that might or might not fire. Rudder barked orders, directing his men to spread out, to wait until the tanks closed the distance. The first shell hit near the old command post, sending a plume of dirt skyward. The shockwave flattened men where they stood. Lommel and two others crawled through the trenches toward the approaching armor. When the next shell screamed overhead, they moved. Lommel rose just long enough to aim his bazooka. The rocket hissed through the smoke, striking the tank squarely on its side. The explosion tore through the engine, flames spilling from the hull. The crew bailed out, one on fire, stumbling before he fell. Another tank turned its turret toward them. Lommel dove as the shell obliterated the trench behind him. He felt the heat on his back, the dirt raining down like ash. They held the line through sheer willpower. Every hour brought another skirmish, another small miracle of survival. Ammunition was stripped from corpses. German grenades became American ones. When they ran out of rations, they chewed dry biscuits taken from enemy packs. When their canteens ran empty, they drank rainwater pooled in craters. No one complained. Complaining took energy, and energy was life. In the brief pauses between attacks, the men spoke softly, their voices hoarse. Some whispered prayers. Others muttered names they might never say again. Lommel stared at his hands. They trembled without his permission, caked with grime and blood that wasn't his. He thought of home, of a quiet street back in New Jersey, of the absurd peace of it. Here, peace felt like a rumor. That night, under the pale glow of flares drifting above, a German officer called out from the darkness. His voice carried across the ruined plateau. "Americana! Surrender! You cannot hold." The reply came not in words but in gunfire, sharp, defiant, final. The officer's voice vanished into the wind. By the second night, they had been fighting for nearly 48 hours without relief. The wounded groaned in the dark, tended by medics who had run out of bandages and morphine. The dead were piled against the craters, their helmets stacked nearby to mark the spot. The cliffs echoed with the faint crash of the waves below, a reminder of the sea they had crossed and the fragile boats that had brought them here. And still, no reinforcements, no signal, nothing but the endless rhythm of war. Then just before dawn on the third day, a faint sound reached them through the fog, the distant thunder of engines, not German this time, but American. From the south, a column of infantry from Omaha Beach was pushing inland. The Rangers held their breath, waiting, praying that it wasn't another cruel trick of echo and imagination. But it grew louder, closer, and finally, through the smoke, the first friendly helmets appeared on the horizon. Rudder stood slowly, barely able to believe it. His men, what was left of them, rose beside him. 90 of the original 225 were still standing. The rest were dead, dying, or missing. But Pointe du Hoc was theirs. Against logic, against gravity, against everything war had thrown at them, they had held. As the reinforcements reached the cliffs, one of the Rangers sat down in the dirt, staring at the sea below. The water was calm now, as if nothing had ever happened. He laughed once, a short, broken sound. "We actually did it," he whispered, and somewhere out on the horizon the sun rose again, soft, golden, and indifferent. The reinforcements arrived not as a flood, but as a trickle. Tired infantrymen from Omaha, they coated in salt and soot, their faces blank with disbelief as they climbed the narrow path to the plateau. What they found at Pointe du Hoc was not a battlefield but a scar, a wound carved into the earth itself. The air reeked of gunpowder and rot. The cliffs were streaked black with soot, and the men who had taken them looked less like soldiers than survivors of some ancient cataclysm. Captain Rudder limped forward to meet them. His uniform was shredded, his boots soaked through with seawater and blood. He could barely hear over the ringing in his ears, but he could see the shock in the eyes of the newcomers. The Rangers had dug themselves into the earth, half buried in shell holes, faces grey from exhaustion and grime. They had eaten almost nothing in 3 days. Some could barely stand, yet their rifles were still loaded, their eyes still sharp, their discipline unbroken. "What's your situation?" one of the new officers asked, stepping carefully over a crater rim. Rudder paused for a moment, then spoke the only truth there was. "We hold." Word spread quickly across the Allied lines. Pointe du Hoc had not fallen. The impossible mission, the suicide climb, had somehow succeeded. But for the men who had lived it, there was no victory, only survival. They had no sense of glory, no energy for celebration. They had spent it all in those 3 days of dirt, fire, and fear. When the supply boats finally reached the base of the cliffs, the men could only stare down at them in disbelief. The sea that had once tried to swallow them now shimmered like glass under the pale sun. It looked too calm, too quiet, as if mocking the chaos that had raged above. Ropes still hung from the cliff face, tattered and blackened from gunfire. Some dangled loose, others stiff with dried blood. They were monuments now, silent, swaying in the breeze, each one marking a path that a man had climbed and never returned from. Lamel walked the perimeter of their captured ground, rifle slung over his shoulder. The fields beyond the cliffs were quiet, broken only by the low moan of the wind. He could still see where the German guns had been destroyed, the scorched earth, the twisted metal, the faint smell of burning oil. It was strange to think that this place, just days ago, had been the sharp edge of the German Atlantic Wall. And now it was just dirt again, dirt soaked with the cost of taking it. At dusk, as the sky bled orange and grey, the Rangers gathered around what passed for their command post, a ruined bunker whose roof had caved in. They lit cigarettes, their faces flickering in the weak flame. No one spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say. Each man stared into the smoke, lost in his own silence. One of them, a corporal from Texas, finally broke it. "You think anyone will remember this?" he asked quietly. Rudder looked at him. The captain's voice was a rasp, barely more than a whisper. "Maybe," he said, "if someone tells it right." The next morning brought a new kind of war, not against bullets or bombs, but against the aftermath. The wounded were carried down the cliffs by rope one by one, their bodies swaying gently over the void. The dead were laid out in rows, boots removed, identification tags tied to the laces. There was no ceremony. The medics moved silently, their faces set. Some of the bodies were too mangled to recognize. Others looked peaceful, as if still dreaming of home. For the first time, the men had time to think, and thinking was its own form of pain. The adrenaline had faded. What remained was emptiness. Lumel found himself staring at his hands again. They still shook, though the fighting was over. He wondered if they ever would stop. As engineers arrived to survey the cliffs, they found just how close the mission had come to disaster. Many of the ropes had failed under their own weight. The grappling hooks had barely caught the rock. A few degrees of wind, a few seconds of tide, and the entire operation could have ended before it began. History, it seemed, had balanced on the edge of a blade. In the days that followed, the Germans tried several counterattacks from inland. Each was beaten back, but the fighting never felt clean. It was messy, improvised, personal. The Rangers, reduced now to a handful of battered companies, held the high ground, not with numbers, but with resolve. They had learned the shape of the terrain, every crater and trench, every curve of the ruined concrete. Pointe du Hoc had become their citadel. At night, when the wind rose and the sea below began to roar again, they would sometimes hear the echoes of the battle, the phantom rattle of machine guns, the distant cries that the fog carried up the cliffs. No one said it out loud, but they all heard it. The ghosts of the dead had not gone far. Rudder kept his notes meticulously, even in the chaos. Every casualty, every engagement, every desperate message sent by runner or signal flare. It wasn't pride, it was duty. He knew the world would never truly understand what had happened here unless someone wrote it down. War stories had a way of growing larger than life. But this one didn't need embellishment. The truth was already stranger than fiction. When relief finally came, when they were told they could stand down and move inland, the men didn't cheer. They didn't even move at first. They just sat there staring out toward the sea. For 3 days and 3 nights, that horizon had meant death. Now it meant nothing at all. Rudder stood last, leaning on his rifle as if it were a walking stick. His body was failing, his knees trembling, but his eyes were steady. He looked down at the rope still hanging over the cliffside, then back at the men who had survived the climb. They said it couldn't be done, he murmured, almost to himself. And maybe they were right. Maybe it shouldn't have been. He paused, then straightened his back. His silhouette framed against the ocean light, but it was. The sea kept breathing long after the guns went quiet. Waves, rubbing at the base of the cliffs as if trying to erase the scars. Pointe du Hoc did not return to peace so much as it fell into a tired, uneasy silence. The smoke thinned, the wind shifted, gulls circled again over the broken concrete. Down on the shingle, foam hissed around the stumps of pilings. Up on the plateau, men moved like survivors of a shipwreck, counting heads, counting losses, counting the hours until their hands stopped shaking. Word drifted in from Omaha and Utah that the beaches had held, that the tide of Operation Overlord was pushing inland, that the great machine of invasion was finally grinding forward. Up here, where everything had been measured in feet of rope and inches of mud, the news felt strangely distant, like a rumor brought in by the clouds. Captain James Rudder stood at the cliff's edge with the posture of someone whose body had run out of ways to show fatigue. He could see the ropes still dangling, black against the pale rock, and he could see where some had burned through, leaving frayed ends that swayed like cut nerves. Beyond them, the channel lay bright and indifferent. He tried to mark the difference between the world as it was 2 days ago and the world now, and found that the line was too fine to see. He had known from the start that whether they lived or died, the climb would decide something larger than them. He just hadn't known how hard the deciding would be. Private Jack Lamel limped past, half his weight on a borrowed walking stick. The medics had told him to rest. He had nodded, then went back to walking. The only thing worse than pain was stillness. He traced the path they had used to move inland, past the empty casemates that had promised so much danger and delivered only the fear of it, through the hedgerow, where he and Sergeant Petty had found the hidden guns and killed them from the inside. He could still taste the sickly metallic tang of the thermite smoke. He had thought, for the length of a single breath, that destroying those barrels would unfasten something in his chest and let him breathe again. Instead, the air had felt heavier. The weight of success, he would learn, was its own kind of burden. Petty slept for the first time in 2 days, his leg wrapped tight, his helmet pulled over his eyes. He had handed his rifle to Lamel yesterday with the matter-of-fact ceremony of a man passing off a family heirloom. Now he muttered something in a dream, the syllables lost to the wind, and turned deeper into the blanket. Around him the wounded lay in a row, boots neatly set beside them, tags tied with careful knots to frayed laces. A medic with the unlined face of a boy moved from patient to patient, counting pulses, changing dressings that bled through in seconds, pressing lips closed with a tenderness that did not belong on a battlefield. He looked like someone who had wandered onto a stage set for a tragedy and found himself trapped in the play. Engineers paced off distances, sketched the ruins, ran their hands along the fractured skin of the bunkers the way a doctor probes a broken rib. You could see in their movements what the war had already started to decide, that these ruins would be studied, not simply swept away. The Atlantic Wall had been called impregnable. Now it had edges you could measure and cracks you could trace with a pencil. In a few weeks there would be reports, photographs, lessons to teach and carry forward. But none of that belonged to the men squinting into the wind. Their study was the simpler kind, where the ground dipped, where a sniper had been, where a friend had fallen and wouldn't be moved until the stretcher men returned. An officer from a beach regiment clambered up the path with a small entourage and a notebook full of questions. He wanted names, timings, exact numbers for a report that would travel faster than any of the men who'd made those numbers possible. Rudder answered as best he could, voice raw, handwriting cramped and angular as he scrawled in his log. He wrote the dates and the hours, the count of effectives, the repeated message he had sent with runners when radios had failed, "We hold." And he wrote the phrase again without meaning to, as if the words had become a rhythm his hand could not forget. The visiting officer looked over his shoulder and nodded solemnly, already translating carnage into narrative. He promised recognition. He promised relief. He promised a memory that would not fade. Memory has its own discipline, and it rarely agrees with promises. Years would pass, and people would argue about the size of the guns, the depth of the craters, the exact angle of the ropes, as if correcting the geometry could redeem the suffering. Films would reshape the climb into something cleaner, with the spray catching sunlight and the grenades falling in cinematic arcs, the cameras hovering close to faces that did not twitch when shrapnel hissed by. But the men who had been there remembered other details. A rope going slack under a dead man's weight, the way a tracer set canvas alight on contact, the smell of wet wool and singed hair, the quiet that followed a grenade in a bunker, the kind of quiet that does not forgive or explain. News reached them at last that the 155s were confirmed destroyed, that their absence had spared the beaches below, a punishment no one cared to imagine in numbers. The ache in Rudder's face shifted, not into relief, not quite, but into something like consent. This had been the point. The cascade of decisions that began with the first briefings in England and ended with men clinging to splintered ladders had resolved where it needed to resolve. The beaches held. The war was moving inland. Pointe du Hoc had been a hinge, and it had swung the right way. At sunset, Lommel found the edge again and sat with his boots dangling over the drop, the wind worrying at his coat. He rolled a cigarette he would not finish. The sea below tugged at the rock in steady breaths. He tried to follow one wave all the way in, to choose a single moving thing and track it through to the end, but each one broke into mirrors and found a different shore. He stared until his eyes watered and then let them close. He saw the corridor of trees where the guns had waited, the way the breach yawned around the thermite, like a beast that had learned too late how sharp the bait was. Petty's hand on his shoulder, the squeeze that said more than thanks. The moment afterward, when he had wanted to call out to someone, anyone, that they had done it, and found he had no voice. Below them, the fleet was still there, spread in a patient geometry across the horizon, the great grey hulls breathing smoke into the evening. For 2 days, the Rangers had looked up to the cliffs as a wall. Now those same cliffs made a parapet, a place to watch from, a place to decide the direction the body would face when the next order came. You could feel, in the way the air moved around the shattered parapets, that the world had tilted slightly toward the future. Rudder gathered the men who could walk. The formation looked nothing like a formation, ranks bent, uniforms misfit and soaked, faces that had forgotten how to hold a neutral expression. He spoke quietly. He thanked them with words that were too small, because all words are too small in the aftermath. He told them what the engineers had confirmed, what the artillery spotters had radioed, what the ships had seen through their glass. He told them that what they had done had mattered past their own survival. He did not tell them that of the 225 who had rowed toward the cliff, barely 90 could stand here now. They already knew the math of it. He did not tell them that this would follow them, that for the rest of their lives stairs would be cliffs and ropes would whisper, because that belonged to a different war. When the order came to move inland, a few of the men hesitated, not from fear, but from a strange fidelity to the place. To leave felt like an offense to the fact that they had taken it. Rudder understood. He let them have their minute. The gulls wheeled once, crying. The wind shifted and carried a scent of wild thyme up from a ragged patch of ground that had somehow kept growing through blast and fire. They descended in ones and twos, picking their way down the goat path the Germans had built for maintenance, and the Rangers had turned into a lifeline. Stretcher teams threaded past with a patience that looked like grace. The ropes clung to the rock, frayed and sun-blackened, and then one by one, engineers began to haul them in. The last coils came up stiff and salt-crusted, and a corporal gathered them as carefully as if they were flags. In the years afterward, visitors would come and stand at the edge where the grass grows close to the wind, and they would look down at the rock face and up at the broken casemates and try to imagine the span between sea and summit. Guides would explain the angles and distances, the calibers and ranges, and schoolchildren would press their palms to the warm concrete in summer and to the iron-cold rail in winter. If they were lucky, they would meet a man with white hair and a cane who would place a hand on the parapet and tell them how the rope felt when it bit his palms, and how a cliff can change a person, not because it is high, but because it is answered. The legacy of Pointe du Hoc is not a monument, though there are stones set and names carved and flags that flex in the salt air. The legacy is a proof that there are moments when skill and courage must do work for which there is no rehearsal, that sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points is a vertical line, that war is decided as often by the 4 inches between a man's grip and the next knot as by maps and markers, that ruin can be a kind of instruction if you know how to read it. The Rangers taught the lesson with their hands, and they're dead. History learned it slowly and then claimed it as if it had always known. On that last morning before the column turned inland, Lommel stopped at the head of the trail and looked back. The cliff did not look conquered. It looked exactly as it had looked when they first saw it, patient, ancient, and uninterested in the events conducted on its skin. He thought of the 5 guns in the hedgerow, the whispering hiss of thermite, Petty's bandaged leg, Rudder's voice when it broke into a rasp at the word hold. He thought of the first rung on the first ladder and the way gravity had tried, very reasonably, to complete the work it had begun. He placed his palm on the raw concrete and held it there until the chill sank into his bones. Then he turned, settled the borrowed stick under his arm, and followed the men into France. Behind them, the sea kept breathing, and the wind sang through the ruined apertures where barrels once pointed at the horizon. The world had not been remade in a single climb. It had only been given a chance. Sometimes that is all history asks of the living, not to win it outright, but to haul a line over the edge and hold so that others can come after and find the footing you spent yourself to make.